If you like, you can stay in this state. I'm going to talk a little bit about energy. And in Buddhism, this concept, one of the stages of the Noble Eightfold Path is right effort. Right effort. And it really is about energy. It is about cultivating a sense of flow in being in the world. It is about this term called upaya kausalya, which is skillful means. Skillful means attending to things, responding to things in ways that are helpful and appropriate for the context, for whatever the situation calls for. And part of this quality is responding, engaging with life in a way where our energy is well balanced, in such a way that our effort is just enough and not too much, and feeling a sense of flow just by simply moving a limb or standing or sitting quietly, even sitting in stillness, feeling flow there too, from one moment as it unfolds into the next, naturally and without effort. So, this notion of energy, which has many forms, and the various forms of energy are conditioned by the various forms of consciousness that we're cultivating. So, for example, if we're cultivating love, if we're cultivating compassion, then the energy of love and the energy of compassion arises in our body, in our subtle body. If the energy of clinging, of habit and addiction arises because we are cultivating, or rather helplessly uh, feeding energy of attachment and clinging, then that's what manifests. And the yogic tradition, the Buddhist tradition, both deeply recognize that the kind of consciousness that we are investing in grows in accordance with its own direction. This is a very natural principle that if I start thinking about chocolate, um, that my consciousness will continue to evolve in the direction of wanting chocolate. If I start thinking about compassion or responding gently with love, then that's the kind of consciousness that arises. So, what we focus on determines basically the kind of consciousness that arises. And we have so many choices there. And every once in a while, we don't have a choice. If we get angry, it arises in us. And the tendency of anger is to become more angry, perhaps. We escalate, we go on a rant, whatever it may be. This is quite natural. Never judge yourself for uh, the states that feed into more and more. This is what it does. And so we may not have a choice in the moment, but then once the rant is over, we may have a choice then in what happens next. So that's the good news, actually. So rather than judging the rant and going, oh, I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have said that, I may choose to practice some self compassion and go, yeah, it makes sense this happened. And I don't like that it happened, but it happened. And I'm going to love the suffering. I'm going to give love to the suffering that led to this arising rather than judge it harshly and try to sublimate it somehow. So, so energy, there is an interesting paradox here in what's called the Abhidharma, which is the Buddhist, this long, kind of very dry text of Buddhist psychology that recognizes that energy determines consciousness and consciousness determines energy. It's an interesting apparent paradox. It's not such a strange thing. It's ultimately not a paradox because there is this sort of cyclical process that we are engaged in. And this is why consciously cultivating something like compassion can kind of short circuit a cycle that causes suffering, or that's born of suffering and maybe leads to more suffering. Um, so, upaya kausalya, this term that means skillful means. Upaya is means. That's the Sanskrit term for means or a way of something. And kausalya is skillful. So sometimes it's just called upaya, just on its own. But upaya kausalya is the actual official term for skillful means. And how do we respond to life skillfully? What does that mean? My teacher Leslie used to talk to us about a term. She used the term impeccability. Impeccability, what Leslie used to talk about was that it is the perfect balance of energy management, of managing our energy, mental energy, physical energy, so that we aren't getting off balance when things happen in life. In a way, we can say that impeccability is the same thing as flow, we might call flow. Csikszentmihalyi is a positive psychologist who wrote a book called Flow. It's a very interesting book. It's very Western psychology, which is not a bad thing. Um, Maybe some of you have read it. But the point here is, and I think some of the wisdom there, is that part of flow involves skillful means, because there's so much that arises in us to push us off balance. Every time something happens, maybe even every thought we have, we find it hard to maintain equilibrium. And so, part of cultivating skillful means and an evenness of our energy, it has to do with equanimity, non judgment, and an engagement with things without judging any of it, meeting all things with an even mind, meeting things evenly, if you will. There is no more, this is a good thought, this is a bad thought. This is a good person, this is a bad person. But there is simply, this is a thought. And this thought arises independent upon conditions that created this thought, and it will disperse in the same way. This person is in front of me. I may not like this person or feel like I like. And the reason that I feel this is an arising because of certain causes and conditions. Maybe it's an interaction with this person that leads me to feel this way. Or maybe it's a quality that we just don't care for. This person will pass away too. And so part of this is recognizing impermanence and thus meeting things with this evenness of mind. So, how does energy play into this? Well, this wonderful term that we find in Zen, beginner's mind. Beginner's mind is really an operant term here. Beginner's mind. Just seeing that whatever we're projecting onto a situation or something that we're thinking or feeling about is really just that. It's a projection. And we may have an opinion about it. We may think we're absolutely right about it. Maybe we are. But so what? So what? Rather, can I respond to this with enough evenness to be skillful, with enough equanimity to make a wholesome impact, and with enough engagement in that equanimity and enough compassion to respond to the suffering that is there and all around us, that is in line with my deepest intention. It's so easy to get spun off in those fun, seductive narratives of judging and laughing at things, and I do it too. So, but we're talking about the relative state. We're talking about the conventional relative state of being in the world as opposed to what Buddhism sees as the ultimate state, which is ultimately we want to come back to what is wisdom here. And so the question really becomes, how do we see ourselves impacting our environment in any given situation? And that really becomes the practice, or more so than the practice, the path. So the practice happens on the path. And part of the first step, or maybe it's not the first step for some of us, but is to recognize that all of the things we see and experience, we see in terms of energy, not in terms of inherent thingness of them in and of themselves. But all things are really just energy. When we practice deeply and for longer periods, we start to experience this naturally. When we start to see the world in terms of energy and not in terms of inherent thingness, our perspective begins to change. This person that I didn't really care for a minute ago is actually quite changeable. Maybe their personality is a lifelong sort of tendency and quality, but um, we see them as energy. Maybe they or things that we encounter, other things, have the same causes and conditions, the patterns that keep leading to the same outcomes. Maybe they're stuck there. People we don't like are stuck in those things, as are we. So, seeing things in terms of energy is really important. And it happens naturally with our practice when the mind becomes subtle and workable, when consciousness is directed into a tendency that's wholesome or that recognizes our deepest intention, when stillness arises by simply focusing on the breath, on spinal breathing, or on hushing, the shushing, or on the sighing, whatever. this the nature of who we are has multiplicity to it. There are various layers. And part of our practice, and this is, I think, the main takeaway here, is to be able to hold that multiplicity in one moment so that the moment isn't just one thing. Does that make sense? Meditation helps us become more spacious, to recognize the various dimensions within which we are abiding. It helps us to attune to those dimensions a bit more without reacting to them. Because the point becomes the holding itself, not the reacting, not the fixing or the problem solving, but simply abiding in this spaciousness of our own awareness. It doesn't mean everything else has to go away, but what it does mean is that we are able to hold things in a hugely spacious way. And what we find is that all of those other layers begin to change on their own. This is the truth of our realization and practice. Very cool. We can practice this multiplicity of attention, if you will. Um, what Leslie used to call, what did she used to call those? Oh, the simultaneity of awareness. Other people have called it multiple attention, and there's a lot of words. I used to play around with the term spectral awareness. And when I asked people, some of you were part of this day, they said, we don't like that term. That doesn't work. Sounds like a ghost or something. So I won't use that terminology. Marie, it looks like she remembers that. Laughing. Um, anyway, the point is we can cultivate this quality of attuning to the different dimensions and quote unquote energies by allowing our meditation to become open enough to where we can feel the physical body, the subtle breath, and awareness all at once. Mindful awareness encompassing the various dimensions in one moment. It may sound complicated, and the mind is like, what on earth is that about? How do I do that? Well, it's an experience. You'll have a direct experience of that. We'll practice that in a moment. What that, how we might open in meditation to the subtlety of these different experiences. So we live in these various dimensions, and a mind, what in Tibetan Buddhism we call sem, S-E-M, which is ordinary, the ordinary thinking mind that is part of the drama, as opposed to what the Tibetans call Rigpa, which is the ground luminosity of our own awareness. These are not the same things, but Rigpa is the encounter of that ground luminosity, where the mind, as the Buddha said, luminous is this mind, brilliantly shining, and it is free of all attachments. There it is, yeah. So getting comfortable with practicing these various layers with equanimity, with clarity, with openness, with beginner's mind, meaning we're not trying to do anything with these things. We're not trying to problem solve or think that we know everything about what's going on out there, but rather we encounter these layers of what's going on within us and we encounter them as impermanent. We encounter them as changeable, with the exception of this open awareness, what we can also otherwise call the changeless, the only thing that is changeless. This continuum, what the Buddha called this continuous aware mindfulness. Not mindfulness one moment to the next where it arises and disperses and comes and goes, but rather a continuous spectrum, a continuous continuum of mindful awareness. So, and in that space, this is where flow arises. When our energy is properly sort of balanced, where we're in that what we call in tennis a sweet spot on the racket, right? Where where we're just sort of hanging in this kind of lucid place. So we're not sleeping, but we are just suspended, buoyant in the moment, like a buoy sort of on the ocean. It's there and it's moving, but it's just being held. Imagine being in the world like this, getting off the cushion and going out and being buoyant and in flow as we talk, as we respond. This is really the heart of what in Mahamudra we call non meditation, which is taking the fruits of our practice and then entering the world with them. It's possible to do.